look into the books of the Old Testament, its character, and the composition of the books that are there. So it's just a review, it's an overview of all the books that we have in the Old Testament. So first of all, we have to recognize that the collection of books that we have in the Old Testament is a collection of faith-oriented writings from ancient Israel. So you have to be very clear that these books are faith-oriented. So anybody who reads it without faith, so logically would not be able to appreciate it. So it is a faith-oriented writings from ancient Israel. Second, it carry authoritative status for Christianity, for Judaism, and to a certain extent, Islam. Because some of the books that we have there, or some of the stories, some of the contents are found also in their Quran. So you will be able to realize that if you read their Quran. It is also a collection of texts that portray God within the history of ancient Israel. So the bias of the writings are precisely to paint a picture of this God that is the God of Israel, and how basically this God intervened or related or interacted with them throughout the history of ancient Israel. So these are a collection of books where you will find history and faith story of ancient Israel are intertwined. So it's really a combination of both the history of a people, at the same time also their faith history or faith story for that matter. Now, the literary materials that you find in this collection is considered eclectic. Eclectic just means a compilation of so many different kinds. It's a collection from different sources. So that's why you will find examples of narratives. Basically, that means stories, prophetic speeches, psalms, legal collection, and wisdom literature, etc. So different kinds of what do you call this, literary materials. If you remember in the first lesson that we have, we already mentioned that the Bible is almost like a library because it contains books that are taken from different moments in history. They have different dates, as well as they are also in different literary forms. So all the more here in the Old Testament, you see basically an eclectic collection of different literary materials. Now, regarding the storyline, it runs basically for more than 1,000 years of social, religious, and political history of ancient Israel as well as its neighbors. So it's a very long, more or less history because, I mean, the timeline that it is representing is more than 1,000 years. Now, the contents originated from various communities within ancient Israel or Palestine and ancient Near East as well. So the authorship, they are considered mostly anonymous, even if many of the books are named after some, it has names on it attached to it, but it's not actually assure us of their authorship. So it's mostly anonymous. So many of these books that are in this collection started in oral form, and then later on they were passed on from community to community, from generation to generation. Now, what was the purpose for writing them down? That's why we have already them in our Bible. It's pretty much the same with the rest, even with the New Testament. It is mainly for preservation. So that as you pass the stories and the contents to so many communities and generations, at least it's going to be stabilized. Otherwise, if it's in oral form until the present, I could not just imagine what it looks like if the story are still basically retained here and there. So it would be difficult to see a common Bible today if they did not early on write them down. and then preserve the text as much as possible. Okay. Now, with regards to the Old Testament contents, the books that we have, they are usually seen from two manuscript traditions. When you talk about manuscript traditions, you're talking about the sources for the books that we have. So we already have, at least in our previous lessons, we talked about the distinction between the number of books that are considered canonical for Catholics, as well as the number of books that are considered canonical for Protestants and even the Orthodox Christian churches. So we explained that the reason for the difference has something to do with the source of manuscripts that they follow. Obviously, the Jews would follow the Hebrew tradition because that was the original name of this collection, the Hebrew Bible. So that's the source for the Judaism of the present time. So there's a manuscript that they draw their number of books from. And we also mentioned that basically the books that are there in the Hebrew Bible are only 24. They are counted only as 24. Although the Protestants who basically follow the Hebrew Bible tradition or manuscript tradition, they count them into something greater than 24. Now, the Catholic Church, as well as the Orthodox Christian churches, since we have a little bit longer list of books in the Old Testament. Of course, the explanation for that is we follow the Septuagint manuscript traditions. That's why it included the deuterocanonical books that are considered apocryphal by the Protestants. Okay, so those are the sources for the Old Testament books that we have: the Hebrew manuscript traditions and the Septuagint manuscript tradition. Now, for purposes of manuscript tradition, would group this number of books into categories or different divisions. So here we mentioned that the first group comprised of 5 books is the Torah or Pentateuch in the Christian context. So that's the first collection, first group. Then the next one would be the prophets or the Nevi'im, and then the writings. The rest of the books that are not in the first two categories are put together under the heading writings, the Ketuvim. So that's why we mentioned that the Tanakh or Tanakha of the Jews, that name was basically coined out of this collection. You have the Torah, so the T is from the Torah, and then the N is from the Nevi'im for prophets, and then K is from the Ketuvim for writings. So Tanakha or Tanakh. So that's basically what we will follow here. So in our presentation, we will be presenting you these different books in these 3 different groups. But for our class this morning, I will only dwell on the first part, the Torah and the Pentateuch, and then we'll discuss the rest tomorrow. So let's begin with the Torah and the Pentateuch. So when we say the Torah or the Pentateuch, we are referring to the first 5 books of the Bible. So you're looking at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So the reason why we call it in the Christian world as Pentateuch, because the origin of that word penta means 5. Teuk basically is from teukos, which means scroll. So basically, that's a reference for the name. So, but we use in the Christian context Pentateuch. The Jews would call it the Torah. The thematic content that you will find in this collection of books are the following. So it talks about creation, you know that in Genesis, and also God's promises to Abraham and the ancestors, the second part of Genesis. Then you have the Exodus out of Egypt is mentioned in the book of Exodus and the succeeding books. The covenant at Mount Sinai and the wandering in the wilderness. Generally, these are the contents of the Torah. Now, if you notice below that, you have Pentateuch, Hexateuch, Tetrateuch. Just for your information, in the context of the study of the Pentateuch, there has been some proposals from scholars in trying to group these books and with the others in a way that will be much more meaningful, at least according to the authors behind them. That's why one was suggesting that instead of having Pentateuch, why don't we consider Hexateuch? So hexa, is what number that? What number is that in Greek? Hexa, do you know? Hexagon. Huh?
6, brother.
Okay,
6.
six. So hexagon has six sides. So hexateuch is what the author was trying to say is with the first five books he said the story is not complete because they haven't settled in the promised land. That's why for the story to be completed, you have to include the book of Joshua in the collection. So it should end with the book of Joshua. So from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Joshua. So because if you can include Joshua, where you find the story of the settlement in the Promised Land, then you have basically a complete story from the time that God has promised to Abraham that he would give them land, and of course, the rest of the story. So, of course, like any other ideas, it was something that was interesting, but eventually it did not actually gather so much following that it was not able to actually take the place of the Pentateuch. And then on the other hand, there was another one. So instead of having six, another one suggested Tetrateuch. So how many is Tetra? What is your guess? Any wild guess? Who among you likes to drink from a Tetra Pak? Drink milk or juice from a Tetra Pak. What does that mean? Any guess? Anyway, the Tetra Pak has four sides, so that basically means four. So Tetrateuch basically is suggesting that instead of covering the whole five books, I think this is suggesting that it might be good to consider only the first four. For the simple reason that Deuteronomy, being the last of the five, Deuteronomy is much better when it belongs to the books that follows it. And they're usually the books that follows it would include Joshua, Judges, you have Kings, Samuel. So those books he wanted to be to where Deuteronomy should belong. The simple reason is because the theme that you have in Deuteronomy is also reflected in these succeeding books that we have, especially when it talks about the renewal of the covenant. Sometimes that collection of books, including Deuteronomy, is called Deuteronomistic history. That's all. But of course, the suggestion was also considered, but eventually it was not really that persuasive enough to change the whole treatment of the book, the first five books, as something that is acceptable. So up to now, they still have maintained to consider in studying the Bible, especially the Old Testament, to consider the first five books together. Okay. Now, regarding the literary features. So, regarding the literary features of that is contained in these first five books. So, we have three different types. You have the narratives, and of course, narratives in general just means story. So, under the narratives, you have the saga, you have etiologies, you have genealogies. The saga is like a story of usually of heroes, for example, the journey of heroes, their life, and what happens to them, and so on. Etiologies are stories that tells us basically how the beginning of something. Like, for example, Jacob's well. They would usually that story will tell you how that's well came about. So that's an etiology. So something that tells you about the beginning of something. And then, of course, genealogies, you're much more familiar with it. It's a listing down of the different generations of members of families. So in the New Testament, the beginning part of the Gospel of Matthew is a genealogy, which we usually use on the second day of Simbang Gabi during our novena before Christmas. So that's genealogies. Another set of collection are legal collections. You probably realize that at least in the book in the Torah, the reason why it's called Torah because it is the law of Israel at the time. So the law of Moses. So if it is the law, then definitely one of its contents would be legal collections, like commandments, like laws, and so on. So you have those things there. Now, aside from the legal collections, there are also liturgical collections, like blessings, rituals, prescription for sacrifice. In Numbers, I think Numbers chapter 6, verse 22, if I'm not mistaken, you'll probably find there the blessing of Aaron. Do you know the blessing of Aaron? Anybody? Have you heard about it? So wala na yatang tao. Are you still here?
Yes,
You
Father.
don't know the anyway, if you have a Bible with you, beside you, you can check Numbers chapter 6, I think, verse 22. It is very famous because you would hear it because they somehow have made it into a song. It's the Lord bless you and keep you. So yes, face set his face upon you and so on. So that blessing. So that's an example of a liturgical collection. Then you have rituals, how they basically do the sacrifice, and some prescription for sacrifices. So there are a lot of that in the context of the Pentateuch. According to David Leiter, the one who wrote this article where I get these things from, he said archaeological discoveries of the ancient Near Eastern cultures in the last 100 years or so have uncovered stories of creation, a great flood, and nomadic heroes who traveled to distant lands to settle down. Though there's still need for more research, some connections are clearly discernible. What does this mean? That in the archaeological discoveries, not only the people of Israel have these stories, but also cultures in the ancient Near East. So that means the culture in that area, they also basically have more or less similar stories that are found in our Bible, in this Pentateuch, like stories of creation, great flood, nomadic heroes. So the question now is, who copied from whom? If our writers grew up in the context where these different cultures are, then definitely they would probably be influenced by these people. The stories that they will use for our stories in our Old Testament may have been inspired or come from them, and then they will just probably adapt it, make it fit basically their needs in the context of people, in the context of the people of Israel. Because even in our own culture, that happens. So there could be stories that are passed on, but you're not sure whether they're based really on reality or they're just basically stories created by the ancestors before, and then it has been passed on as if it's basically what happened. But anyway, that is something that has to be discerned more because a lot of studies could still be done. But it's just an observation that many of the stories that we have in the Pentateuch would find some similarities with some stories in other cultures as well. So that's just basically what David Leiter has mentioned in this context. Now, regarding the authorship of the first five books, it is always identified, even in many of the books in the Bible, that this Pentateuch, the Torah, is also called the Book of Moses, also the Book of the Law of Moses. So generally, traditionally, people have always seen the Pentateuch or the Torah as the handiwork of Moses as author. Of course, the simplest reason that we can probably think of is the fact that at least at the heart of this collection, because it's basically the Exodus story, the deliverance from Egypt, is Moses. So that's why it has been identified with him. Now, when you talk about authorship in the strict sense of the word, in reality, what basically authorship would mean, like the one who really wrote the story, then there will be a problem holding on to that fact that Moses had something to do with writing of these stories. The very first logical thing that you should ask yourself is, do we know if Moses know how to write stories? Of course, he has learned to read and write because he was adopted by the queen. So that's why he lived in the palace. So he must have been educated. But we don't know whether Moses was good at writing stories and so on. So that will be something to really find out, so that we can actually say that indeed Moses could possibly be responsible for writing down these stories. But anyway, for now, scholars are in agreement in saying that there is no way that Moses can be an author to this collection of books. Some of the simplest explanation that they have given are basically these three things: anachronistic references, repetitive stories or accounts, and then some inconsistencies. So these are just basically like a shallow observation on the text. They're not really an in-depth study of it yet. But here you could already see that there might be a problem if we continue on holding on to the fact that, or to the belief, the traditional belief, that Moses is the author behind this collection. So what is contained in these anachronistic references? Anachronism basically would mean showing something not in sync with the time. Like sometimes when you see a movie and it's a period movie, and then the costumes of the people there would not meet the requirement of the time, then that's anachronistic. If someone is wearing a modern dress in a period, for example, in the beginning of the century and so on. So anachronistic references. So what can we find here? If Moses is the author of the collection of the books, why does he write the story of his own death in Deuteronomy 34? If you look at the last chapter of Deuteronomy, you will find there a narrative, an account of how Moses died. Now, if you are the author from beginning to end, so Moses will have a great deal of explaining why would he write about his own death. So it doesn't seem correct. So that's one. And secondly, some passages tell us that the author was writing much later time than the historical period reflected in the Pentateuch. Basically, what that means, the ones who were writing the text of stories like in the time of the ancestors might have been writing at a later time, not in the time of the ancestors. So they are reflecting a historical period that is much later than what the story represents. So that's basically an anachronism. So it doesn't jive. And you will see a very quick example, a very quick example that I can mention here is regarding basically the what do you call this, the differences in time is the fact that when you read, for example, the liturgical collections, it is so organized and so systematic and practically up to so many details you'll be surprised whether Moses and company had the time to actually put those details there. So if what they're saying that these things were written more or less close to the exile, the period of the exile, or after or during the exile, then I think it's much easier to accept it that those details will definitely be a product of a later generation. But Moses and company, I don't think they would have the time and the luxury to be able to come up with all of these detailed prescriptions of sacrifice, rules, and so on. So that's why it's anachronistic actually to see it. So the second one is repetitive stories or accounts. So the keyword here is repetitive. That means they appear not only once but sometimes twice. Here, for example, the story of Moses drawing water from a rock for a thirsty and complaining people occurs in the book of Exodus, chapter 17, 1 to 7. And another story of the same, more or less of the same theme, is in Numbers 20, verses 2 to 13. So you can actually open your Bible and compare. So these are two occasions, or at least texts, and they are basically in different. They are in different books, and yet they talk about practically the same thing. It may not be exact and identical copies, but you know that they are talking about more or less the same thing. The same is true with the Ten Commandments. We are familiar with the one in Exodus chapter 20, but there is another one in Deuteronomy 5. Now, if Moses is the author, how would he explain, for example, the presence of the repetition of these stories? I mean, it's easier to understand it if in the second story, the writer or Moses, for that matter, would say, I already told you about this earlier, but I would like to repeat it. At least that is very clear. That is very clear that the author knows that he consciously repeats the story. But in this case, there are no indications that there is a cross-referencing between the two places where the same story would occur. Like in the drawing from the water, from the rock for water, it's in Exodus 17, and the other one is in Numbers 20. And in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, and then in Deuteronomy chapter 5. So again, you can check those passages, and you will see basically this repetition of the stories. Now, the last one is inconsistencies. So one of the things that an author would usually do with his work is he would edit it and make sure that he doesn't repeat things. And if he repeat things, for example, that they are not there's no danger of them being inconsistent with what was already written. Of course, here and there, it could happen that there could be a little bit of inconsistencies. But I think if the inconsistency is somehow close to one another, it would be difficult to explain why the author would not notice it. Here, for example, is an example that we have. The mountain where God makes a covenant with Moses and the people is called Sinai, Mount Sinai. But in some other portions of the text, it is called Horeb. So if you, for example, encounter that in the book and you're talking to the author, how do you think the author will respond to the question? How can he explain that? That he would use two names to the same places, more or less within practically the same books and within the same context. So that basically tells us that Moses didn't know about the existence of these two usages of two names referring to one reality. The second one has something to do with the name of God. In Yahweh, Yahweh was unknown until the time of Moses in Exodus chapter 3 to 6, where God have shown himself to Moses in a burning bush. And in that occasion, Moses asked what his name was. And he got the answer, I am who am. That's basically what Yahweh means. But the name if you try to read from Genesis, would already occur repeatedly in the book of Genesis. So what does that tell you? When it was first known in the story of Exodus, why was it there when they recount the story about creation and the beginning of the world? So what possible conclusion can you actually give to it? That maybe Exodus was written first, and then Genesis was written at a later time than Exodus, even if the story is representing a period that is older. So that's an inconsistency. There was another one inconsistency that are obvious. If you look at Genesis, I think chapter 7, regarding the, if I'm not mistaken, regarding the flood. In a matter of several verses in between, you consider that at one point, the flood was described to have happened 40 days and 40 nights. And a few verses below that, it mentions that the flood went on for 150 days. I don't think 40 days and 40 nights would be, even if you add it together, it would not amount to 150. It's only about 80. But yet it mentions a few lines later that the duration of the flood was 150 days. Again, it's an inconsistency if you look at the text. And how can that be explained? So that's the problem. Can Moses explain that if he was the author? If there was a single author, can that author explain the occurrence of this? Because the author could say, "I made a mistake," but to make a mistake with that obvious difference, I don't think so. Maybe if you said in one 40 and then the other one you said 41, I can accept that as a real mistake. Because you were not paying attention. But 40 as a number and then 150, these are two great numbers. So it's difficult to actually explain that away. So So these are more or less some of the reason why Moses basically was what do you call this said to be probably not the author behind it. It may have been attributed to him because he played a great role in the story, or because he was a great leader for the people at the time. But to really consider that as an indication of his being author would be difficult actually to prove. That's why the next thing that scholars did was to study the text of the Pentateuch and basically answer the question that if Moses could not be an author on the basis of this observation, and a single author would not be also a basis for authorship because of this presence of this anachronism, this doubling, and then of course the inconsistencies, then how would they explain now the authorship behind the collection of the Pentateuch? So of course, so many scholars have attempted to explain, but in the 19th century, a certain scholar, German scholar, by the name of Julius Wellhausen, he lived between 1844 to 1918. He developed what is called the documentary hypothesis. So this documentary hypothesis is an attempt to collect together the previous studies that made by scholars on the issue of authorship and origins and provenance and sources behind the text that we have in the Old Testament, in the Pentateuch. He published it in his book Prolegomena to the History of Israel, which was published in 1878. So in 1878, they were already able to come up with a documentary hypothesis that would explain to us what could not be explained when we consider Moses as author or a single person as author. So what this documentary hypothesis proposed instead is that they were able to recognize that the text of the Pentateuch comes from four sources. And this Julius Wellhausen suggested to name them as hypotheses. So this is a documentary suggested basically by Julius Verhausen. So he said that the contents of the Pentateuch could actually be divided into four strands or four documents. He calls it the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and then of course the priestly, JEPD or JEDP. So he said that some portions of the text would actually come from the 10th to the 9th century BCE, like in the early ancient Israelite monarchy. So it's still pretty much later than the story of Abraham, Moses, and then occupation of the Promised Land. So it came at the early part of the ancient Israelite monarchy when David, Saul, and Solomon were the probably kings. So that's the oldest that they could actually identify. So 10th to 9th century. And the feature of this collection, a characteristic that is common to them, they use Yahweh when referring to God. That's why it's called Yahwist, because that's the main feature that you can find in this collection of materials. Secondly, another set of materials are considered to be coming from another source. Maybe these were written around the 8th century BCE, during the time when the monarchy was well established, as well as during the time that the kingdom of Israel was divided into the north and the south. So here, the main characteristic or feature of this collection is the use of the word Elohim when referring to God. So that's why it's called Elohist. Now, another group of writings is basically recognized as having a style and theology that was current during the reign and reform of King Josiah, the latter part of the 7th century BCE. So it's almost like towards the time of the exile. So he said there are portions that the theme has something to do with this style and theme that was current in the reform of Josiah, which is basically a renewal of the covenant. That's why the Deuteronomistic history, the collection of books from Deuteronomy to Joshua to Judges to Samuel and Kings, they're considered actually Deuteronomistic history. Precisely because the theme that you find there that are recurring, the theme that is recurring there is basically reform or renewal of the covenant. So you have the Deuteronomistic material. So logically, you can actually already assume that practically the whole of Deuteronomy is mainly Deuteronomistic in terms of its sources. And finally, the last collection that has been identified, the latest strand, is called priestly. Just by the name, you already basically would know what those contain. They are actually materials that has something to do with liturgy, with ritual, with sacrifice, and so on. And these materials are not actually, as I told you, are not contemporary to the time of Moses. They were inexistent. They were not there when Moses and company were traveling from Egypt to Canaan to be able to settle in Palestine. They didn't have those. It's just that they were added in the story to maybe legitimize these activities as part of their tradition in the Jewish tradition. So this dates back. This collection of writings dates back to the post-exilic period in the 5th century or even later. So if the exile happened in the year 586, more or less, or 87, so these materials that we're talking about, this last strand, comes from a later period than that. So it's actually acceptable because it was only after the exile. Of course, it's not immediately. Several years after the exile, that when it was the Persians who was already leading the places where they were occupying, like Babylon, so allowed them already to go back to their original places, especially in Judea, and allowed them also to practice their religion. And that was when when they went back to Judea, that's when they started what you call is rebuilding everything about their community, starting with the rebuilding of the second temple, and then of course the rebuilding of the community and many other things that are connected with them. So the renewal of the revival basically of Israel happened during this time after the exile. So they were eventually called Jews, coming from the word for Judeans, and then of course the religion was known as Judaism. So you cannot tell that in the time of Moses there was already Judaism. No, it happened at that time. Now, if you're interested in how they came up with the plans to restore the community and the temple and the like, you can read basically the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Anybody who is reading the Ezra and Nehemiah can actually be able to know this renewal that they did. So what we're saying is parts of the Pentateuch, the books of the Pentateuch, it has contents coming from this period, post-exilic period in the 5th century or even later, the priestly. So that's generally the explanation of Julius Wellhausen. So the differences that you see, the anachronism that you encounter in the book, the inconsistencies and so on could be explained by this documentary theory. That what you have in the different books in the Pentateuch are collection of materials put together from different sources and from different times. That's why you have those basically sometimes conflicting realities. So that's generally what happened. What happened in that context. So up to now, up to the present, this is still pretty much the best explanation that we can have. It's not basically the final answer to the question, but it's the best explanation usually scholars have to explain basically the authorship behind the Torah or the Pentateuch. Now, in our present time, some scholars have made some fine tuning with this theory. It's still pretty much the theory, but they try to more or less add up to it and improve it by suggesting that instead of using documents, they're suggesting to use the word traditions. Because if you just dwell on the documents, you are forced to come up with a proof that a document actually existed. But when you talk about traditions, you can also include as well oral traditions behind it. So it's more encompassing. But the whole idea is still the same. It's just a matter of terminology. So instead of 4 documentary hypotheses by Julius Wellhausen, later scholars basically more or less adjusted it to actually say that you have 4 traditions hypotheses for the sources behind the authorship of the book of Moses. Is that clear?
Yes, Father.
Okay, so just a few more things. So here's an example of the materials that you can find in this collection. This is Genesis, the creation accounts in Genesis. The first one is Genesis 1, 1 to 2, and then 4a, and then Genesis 2, 4b to 25. I know most of you are familiar with that first chapter, that story of creation, but you hardly would probably remember the second part. But it's the second chapter. It's another way of telling the story. It's different, but at the same time, it's not really opposite. So here, if you compare these two stories, you already see different types of stories. I mean, different stories coming from different contexts and origins. Now, if you look at the literary expression in the narrative, in chapter 1, you have a prose with poetic refrains and formulas. You're familiar with that. Each time that God would create something, it will always end up by saying, uh, uh, evening came, morning came, first day. And you will basically see that. So it's this kind of a refrain that happens to indicate that we are now on the first, on the second, on the third, up to the 6th day of creation. and then he rested on the seventh. So it has poetic refrains and formulas. While in Genesis chapter 2, it's prose, it's story, but with no poetic refrains and formulas. It's just basically a simple storytelling, unlike the one in the first chapter. Regarding the role of God, the third or fourth role, the role of God, the one in Genesis is distant and remote because, excuse me, in the story, God would only speak and he will say, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then there will be trees here and so on. So he will just speak and he was distant. It's as if God was just using a remote control because he was basically just speaking from a distance and then things were happening. That is the role of God in the first story of creation. Compared to the second chapter, it's an involved kind of a role. That means God is involved. In fact, God is presented in an anthropomorphic manner. That means what he did during creation was seen more or less as someone, in a way, some human people or human beings would do. That's why you will see that later on. So much more, God is much more closer in Genesis chapter 2 than in the role that he played in the first chapter. Now the mode of creation. How did God create it? In the first chapter, God created by speaking. That's why logos is important in Genesis in the beginning as well as in the beginning of the Gospel of John. So word, he was speaking. So bara in Greek, in Hebrew. So he was just saying, "Let there be light. Let there be a division. Let there be some trees and plants." So and so on. He was basically just speaking it out loud, and then it was happening. While in the context of the second chapter, as I mentioned, God was much more involved and was basically playing a role that looks like the role of a human being. So here, God is presented as creating by molding and then forming and planting. So that's definitely something that God could come close to us. Now, the time frame in chapter 1, it's 7 days after the time that God has rested. But in Genesis chapter 2, it is less definite. There is no time frame. Now, here you see basically the tradition behind them. The one behind chapter 1 is actually, it appears like that the story that you have in chapter 1 is actually something that is much more liturgical. So its features, liturgical features, point to a worship sits in Laban. That means a worship context. Hence, so the first chapter story is creation is from the priestly tradition. Do you remember the priestly tradition? From what age or time it came from? It is actually the last strand. So it came basically after the exile. So you know that this first chapter that we are familiar with is actually may have been used in liturgy rather than in any other occasions. So the other one in Genesis chapter 2, its consistent use of Yahweh indicates that it is coming from the Yahwistic tradition. So that means, at least if you want to make a conclusion on this comparison, Genesis chapter 2 is older than Genesis chapter 1. Because the Yahwist basically is from the 10th to the 12th century, but the Genesis 1 is from the 5th century and later. So that's one example of the study and analysis that they have given to things like this. And then, of course, we have to realize that the whole Pentateuch is actually an entity. It's a connected stories. I mean, they may have been put together from different sources, but the purpose for putting them together is to come up with a cohesive story from the beginning to the end. That's why the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books, the Torah, is actually the beginning story of ancient Israel. It has to start with creation, and then, of course, what happened during the first part of Genesis. You have basically the story of the people, like the origins and so on. And then, but the real story of Israel started with the call of Abraham, which basically begins in chapter 12 until the end of Exodus. So it's a beginning story of ancient Israel, but the way it is told is basically emphasizing a very important message. That's why the kernel of the story, the gist of the story, what is at the heart of the story, what is at the center of this collection, is actually that covenant between God and Moses with the people on Mount Sinai. So that's why the whole of the Pentateuch should be actually read from that perspective. So the relationship or the covenant between God and Moses with the people, or the story of God and Moses with the people on Mount Sinai. Now, the preceding stories before that, before this happened, are basically what you find in Genesis, and of course the succeeding event that had happened after that. You have the creation to the Tower of Babel, which is Genesis 1 to 11. That's the first part. And then second part, the sagas of ancestors from Genesis 12 to 50. And then Moses and Aaron and the Pharaoh of Egypt, that story in Exodus. And then the Exodus event happened. So that's basically what is at the center. And then what happens after that is their difficult travel. They're very challenging, and at the same time, something that was really helping them realize themselves, the travel in the wilderness to the promised land, which is basically seen in the rest of the book of Numbers. And then, of course, their entry into the land and settlement, which is basically mentioned in Deuteronomy towards the end, but it's just basically pointing out that Moses was not able to go with them into the promised land. He was only able to see it from afar, I think from Mount Nebo, and he died there. And it was already Joshua that took over the leadership of the community, and it was Joshua that, and together with Caleb, that brought them into the promised land. So that's why you have basically the contents of the story here. So that's pretty much basically what is behind this. Okay. So anyway, we'll continue with the rest of the books as when we meet again tomorrow morning. For now, I think this would be enough for today.